age where everything can be recycled. And even Torah can be taken to other places where people didn't get a chance to hear it yet. So one of the topics that came up while Sean, Shlomo, and I were learning was the identity crisis in this generation, which is a new thing. I think it's about 20, 30 years old. It began in the 60s, 70s, but it's really propagated now. And it's touching everything. Okay? It's touching from gender identity to obviously political identity, but race identity and all the other types of identity. So he asked me to speak about it and maybe show something of a Torah perspective on what needs to be done with it. The trigger really was that we talked about homosexuality. And I had my explanation for him, and he wanted me maybe to share it with you, so that we'll get a chance for it. But before I start, I need to say something. My other teacher, apart from Rav Ginsburg, is Rav Steinsaltz, who passed away almost 2 years ago now. I don't know if you know who he is. Rav Steinsaltz was the first human being, probably, who wrote an entire commentary on the entire Talmud himself. Even Rashi, who we all know is the great expositor of the Talmud and the Torah, didn't finish the entire Talmud. There were parts that he didn't get to, a few masachtot, a few parts that he didn't, a few volumes that he didn't get to. Rav Steinsaltz was, as Newsweek called him, and we always used to joke with him about that, a once-in-a-millennium intellect, like a once-in-a-millennium scholar. He truly was. It was something out of this world. And the great thing about him was that if he traveled all over the world. Every other week he was in Chutz La'aretz. He lived in Eretz Yisrael in Yerushalayim, but every other week he was somewhere else in the world. And usually when people talked to him, he never talked to them about Torah. He just told them stories. But he had incredible stories from places you couldn't imagine. Where would anybody even collect these stories? All of them very, very strong stories. So in any case, one of the things that he was a critic, obviously. He was very sharp. When he was young, they used to say that you couldn't sit with him because after 5 minutes, you felt that you were reduced to ashes. There was nothing left. But he loved people. You could really sense his love of humanity. One of his interesting critiques was about what people study as Torah, what people see as Torah. And you know that in Israel, it's not a religious country by any sense. Religion is a little bit more than in America, a little bit more identified with religion than here, but not much more. And one of the things that they decided to do when they founded the state was that there should be, even in the regular schools, the public schools, there should be some study of Torah. So what did they choose? To teach everybody, so that everybody would know something about Yahadut, something about Yiddishkeit. So they chose the Tanakh. Okay? They chose the Bible. Is that a good choice? Not a good choice. So Rav Steinsaltz put it like this. When you teach a young child, a teenager, Tanakh, and that's his picture of Yiddishkeit, of the connection to God, what does he end up with? He ends up with the ideal being to be a prophet. That the Judaism thinks that the ideal is being a prophet. Well, you know what prophets are like in the Bible. How do they all end up? They don't have good ends. Because what did they do? They criticized society. They had their opinions. They didn't talk to anybody. They're just sort of like an op-ed, right? Somebody who writes opinion columns. So they wrote opinion columns, and they said, this is bad because of this. God wants not this, but he wants this, and so on and so on. And they critiqued society more and more and more until eventually most of them were killed. Okay? So he says, if you learn Tanakh, your ideal, you think that to be the highest level of a person who has connection to God is to be a prophet. But that doesn't end well. So he says, what did we get? In Israel, we got 6 million little prophets. Everybody knows everything. And there's no dialogue because they can't talk to each other because the prophet never talked to anybody. He speaks to God alone. He answers to God alone. And that's it. Said Rav Steinsaltz, what happened after prophecy ended? After prophecy ended, we got the Talmud. The Talmud is a completely different creation. It's a completely different type of work. The Talmud is a discussion. And even though the people were not even contemporary, meaning they didn't live in the same era, the editors of the Talmud brought them together, 500 years of sages that they brought together, and they bring them into dialogue. And they say, he thinks like this, and he thinks like this. They don't necessarily finish the conversation. A lot of times they leave the conversation hanging. It doesn't come to a conclusion necessarily, but it teaches you the art of dialogue. It teaches you the art of discourse. It teaches you that wisdom is gained by people speaking to each other. That the highest ideal, according to the Talmud, is what we call a sage, not a prophet. And a sage is someone who knows how to talk and share opinions and hear the other person and begin to understand it. And by having more and more people join the conversation, God appears more and more in the world. Meaning that the Talmud's ideal of a Jew is a person who is involved with others. He's not sitting alone like a prophet saying God says this and God says this. He doesn't know everything. He has an opinion, but he wants to hear other opinions. And as he hears the other opinions and the dialogue progresses, knowledge progresses, and that is what God is. That we understand more and more about what the Torah wants from us, what God is saying, what is godliness in the world, what does it mean to have an upright life, what does it mean to have a good life, because in the end, that's what humanity is about. And so he says they chose the Tanakh, but they chose poorly. They should have chosen the Talmud. The Talmud would have built a different type of ideal for the people. Now, the reason I bring this up here, first of all, is because I wanted to mention Rav Steinsaltz, because we talked a lot about Rav Ginsburg, but I also have Rav Steinsaltz. The other reason was because one of the things that I learned from Rav Steinsaltz, and he impressed this upon us a lot, is that Judaism is not a frozen picture in time. Judaism has to, and what I mean by dialogue is that you take new things that happen in the world, and you begin to ask, so what does the Torah have to say about this? You don't come with a preset opinion, oh, the Torah says so and so. You don't know yet. Yeah, you have to talk to them. It has to be done. I'm not saying this happens. It's not that it doesn't happen. But a lot of people have a misconception that somehow we know all the answers beforehand. And they miss the process by which we come to answers, okay? Which is a very important process in and of itself. That's called learning Torah. That you can't come and make up an answer. You have to have sources. You have to say, okay, it says here and it says here, and you have to think about it, and what does this mean, and so on. Is it applicable? Is it not applicable? And so on and so forth. But that's a way to relate to things that happen in the world. In the end, we have to ask, okay, so there's something happening in the world, in this case, the identity crisis. When I look at the Torah, can I find things that somehow are related to this, and that can shed some light on it? So let's go back to what prompted Sean to ask me to talk about it. So we were talking about homosexuality. Homosexuality is one thing. What the Torah talks about is not homosexuality. The Torah is talking about a certain sexual act that is forbidden. Okay? The Torah is not talking about identity or sexual identity, because there's no discussion of it there. You could project and extrapolate and say, oh, if a certain act is forbidden and it's forbidden, then that means the whole identity is a problem. But that you would have to prove that. You would have to show that that's true. And in my opinion, it hasn't been shown to be true. I don't think that it's true. So there are two different things. And why is this? Because the world has changed. People change. And the psychology of people develops and changes. One of the premises of Chassidut, especially of Chabad Chassidut, is that the redemption is actually, in many ways, the revelation of the psyche. People 100, 200 years ago had a psychology. Because in that sense, we're all human. Even people 200 years ago had an ego. They had what they wanted, and they had what they felt was pleasurable, and what they believed in, and so on. And there was a whole psychology. And they had shame, and they had pride, and they had all the feelings. The difference is that 200 years ago, almost nobody talked about it. And there was no way to really express it because there wasn't even a language really that the common person would be aware of. And even if he would be aware of it, there would be almost no one to go to. Because nobody spoke that language. Nobody knew that language. The Baal Shem Tov, who founded the Hasidic movement, his big, you called it, in a sense, a premonition, an understanding of human nature was that this is about to come out. What we call the inner space is about to come out. And when it comes out, there's going to be a new language created, and Torah has to keep up. Because this new world that we're discovering inside of us, each person to his extent of how much he discovers it and how much it plays a role in his life and so on, this world has to have also a connection to Torah. So basically, if you ever learn Tanya, Tanya is a translation from the language of the sages from 1500 years ago to modern psychology. Except it's not exactly the modern psychological terms because it's not speaking either German or English, but it has the terms that were borrowed, some of them from the Zohar, some of them from the sages themselves, and some of them were just invented. Because you have to invent words to describe something that you now see and feel and experience and have to treat. It's okay. It gives me a good chance to... So this is a major premise of Yiddishkeit, of Torah, is that Torah is constantly evolving, in the sense that it's constantly trying to treat what is out there in the world, trying to make sense of it, trying to see it in a particular light that no one else has. Nobody else has the Torah, so nobody else can create this dialogue about what is it that the Torah says about these things. And when you come to this thing of the identity crisis, which I'll try to explain in a moment what I think it is, then you have to find language in the Torah that discusses this, or at least ideas that are similar in some way. Because the Torah doesn't talk, there's no parsha called the parsha of identity crisis. There's nothing like that. So the first thing to try to understand is what is this identity crisis exactly? Our modern world allows us to start from scratch in a way that was impossible 100 years ago. What I mean is that people, when they begin to live their lives, they don't necessarily have to quickly assume an identity. 100 years ago, something like that, 120 years ago, when a child was born, he automatically assumed the identity of his parents, in all respects. You go back a little bit more, if his father was a tailor, he was a tailor. If his father was a farmer, he was a farmer. 99% of the people were buried within 5 miles of where they were born. That's the type of world it was. There was no social mobility. There was no ability for the person to think, what do I want for myself? Who am I? All these questions were impossible because the simple act of existing, of persisting, of being able to stay alive required all of a person's time and energy. And when there was anything left over, it usually wasn't for philosophizing. It wasn't used for thinking about who I am. Certainly there wasn't any media that kept asking you, so who are you? There was nobody to ask you from the outside to define yourself. There was nothing like that. But the moment that we entered into the modern world, and as the sages told us that this, and the prophets told us that this age would be, the age before the redemption would be an age of plenty, that there would be everything almost for free. If you want to compare what it means almost for free, if you go by the wealth of an average individual today compared to an average individual in 1780, let's say, the eve of the first industrial revolution. So we have a commonly accepted number is that each industrial revolution multiplied a person's wealth by 10 times. So we're today we're in the middle of the 5th industrial revolution. So the average person today is about 10,000 times richer, more wealthy than the average person 250 years ago. It's an important number to understand. We're 10,000 times. So imagine if you were 10,000 times wealthier than what you are now. If you have $1 million, let's say, of net worth, so you'd have how much? He's the accountant, right? How much is 1 million times 10,000? 10 to the 11th, right? 10 to 10. So think about what that would mean in terms of your possibilities in the world. What kind of life you would want to live if that was... Now, comparing ourselves to somebody in 1780, that's exactly what happened. We're living that $10 billion worth compared to him. So obviously our life is completely different. You just can't compare it. And the moment that you have the opportunity to ask these questions, who am I, what do I want to be, how do I identify myself, and so on and so forth, it opens up everything. So it began from asking, what do you want to go to study in school, right? There's all... Public schools are something new. Again, who started the public school? Bismarck in Prussia. We're only talking about 160 years ago. He started the first public school. Before that, what did people do? Yeah? If your father knew how to read and write, maybe he taught you. But that was other. Jews had a different construct, because Jews tried to get as many people as possible to learn Torah, so you had to know to read and write. But in general, the world was in a different place. So you first ask the question, what do I want to be when I grow up? And then that question becomes called a banal. Everybody asks that question. So you begin to ask other questions. Who am I? And you could begin to ask, maybe I'm not happy with who I am. Maybe I'm not even happy with my gender. Maybe I'm not happy with my pronouns. I'm not happy with this and not happy with that. And it begins to work. Why? Because there is a natural process that a person goes through of determining his identity. It's just that this process was masked for thousands of years, and suddenly now it's open. So when it opens up, and you have the opportunity, so it's not so clear that you end up navigating this question properly. You may have pitfalls along the way. You may have you may come to all kinds of incorrect conclusions, which later in life you'll understand were not warranted. You should have waited a little. Then you would have seen that maybe there is a simpler answer to this question of who am I. I told Sean, I think today, an example that when my eldest was 4 years old, he decided that he was a snail. This was a cute thing. So, a child comes home from school and he says, from kindergarten, he says, I'm a snail. So you laugh and you shrug it off. That's very nice, okay. But then when he comes back the next day and he tells you he's still a snail, and next day, and next day, and next day, and next day, and then he starts getting angry at you if you call him by his name, because my name's Snail. And then he begins to draw himself as a snail. You begin to get worried. What is this? What is going on here? So being that it was our first child, we didn't know what to do. So we called Rav Ginsburg and we asked him, what should we do? Should we do something? After 4 months, we asked him. We didn't ask him right away. And he said, no, just ignore it. Whatever he wants, tell him whatever he wants. And sure enough, after a few months, it passed, it disappeared. He doesn't remember today that there was such a phase in his development, because he was too young to really remember it. And these things happen all the time, and they happen to even to adults sometimes. What we call the mid-age crisis, which almost everybody here has already passed. I haven't yet, I'm about 16, right? But the mid-age crisis. So where you don't know who you are anymore. Why you don't know? You do know who you are, but you're tired of your job, you're tired of your marriage, you're tired of this, you're tired of that, and you begin to want to redefine things and switch them up and this and this. So you just have to get through it. It's not such a big deal. It lasts a year, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years. How long are you going to live? It's not going to last forever. Eventually it passes. And you don't give up a winning horse just because you changed its name. Because you have to have patience for these things. So really, this process of identity formation is something that is new to us, but it was always there. It just didn't have the opportunity to happen. So that's all well and good. And if a person follows and has patience and has a normal upbringing, usually these things work themselves out. Except what we're seeing today is far beyond that. It's not anymore just a problem with, 2% of the population. It's probably a problem with a lot more. And when you get to higher numbers, you have to look for some kind of reason why this is happening. Why is it not working out the way it should? So a lot of people blame the media, and they blame Hollywood, and they blame this, and they blame that. But we know as Jews that there's only one person, there's only us to blame, right? The Jews are always to blame. And it's true. Meaning that we are entrusted with the spirituality of the world. We're entrusted with the psychology of the world. It's not by mistake that Freud was a Jew and everybody around him was Jewish except for Jung. Jung he kicked out quickly and the rest of them remained Jewish. It's not by mistake. It's not by mistake that Chassidut, that Hasidic thought came, there's many mystical traditions in the world, but it came from Judaism. It's not by chance that this happens, because we are entrusted with this. This is supposed to be something that we're supposed to nurture the world with. We're supposed to coach the world on what it means to have a good spiritual life, what it means to nurture the soul. But we have an identity crisis. It's not a big secret. If you look back 200 years ago, there was no Jew who wasn't observant. There was no such thing. The moment he wasn't observant, he already wasn't a Jew. He was immediately out. There was no way to retain. But an identity crisis means that you walk without and you feel with, or you walk with and you feel without, right? It's like I can be this or that at the same time. I'm androgynous in the end. I can be both things. I can be a Jew at home, like Mendelssohn said, and I can be a non-Jew when I walk outside. That's an identity crisis. It means you don't know who you are. Okay? So this crisis really started from us. But the crisis became much, much stronger, really, with the founding of the State of Israel. Because here was something that was supposed to be the Jewish state, but they couldn't bring themselves to write or even refer to God in the Declaration of Independence. They found it difficult. They couldn't do it. What does it mean? It means that you've got an identity problem. You don't know who you are exactly. The moment that we experience a problem, this propagates. It's like ripples in a pond. And we're the epicenter of the psychology and the spirituality of the world. A lot of people have maybe thought that we're the epicenter of the money in the world. It's not true. It's like everybody else. Some people are more successful, some are less. But every Jew has a propensity to be a leader when it comes to spiritual matters. And people turn to us because the entire world knows, whether sometimes they say it, sometimes they don't, but they all admit the chosen people. What are we chosen for? We're not chosen to sit on Wall Street. We're chosen to guide the world in terms of our connection to God. That's our role. So if we have an identity crisis, this ripples and it propagates into the rest of reality. And when it hits the other shores, it becomes like a tsunami. It's much, much worse than it is even within Yiddishkeit. Within Judaism, it's a question of what kind of Jew do you feel you are. When it propagates outwards, it could be that you don't know what your gender is. You don't know much about yourself. You're left hanging, not knowing how to relate to yourself. And that's the source of it. To give it an example from the Torah, so the Talmud has a very interesting issue that it discusses at the end of Masechet Pesachim, at the end of the tractate of Pesachim, which deals with Pesach. So we just finished Pesach, so it's even a little bit relevant. The Mishnah says that if people were seated together to eat the Paschal lamb, and the whole group, because usually the Paschal lamb was an entire family, it could be 50, 100 people eating one such sacrifice. What happens if they fell asleep? They all fell asleep because there's a lot of food. You don't eat just the Paschal lamb and a lot of wine. And they all fell asleep. and they didn't get a chance to eat it because they didn't get to the Paschal lamb before midnight. And you have to eat it by midnight. So what happens then? So the Mishnah says, I'm sorry for taking it to this direction, but this is how the dialogue starts. This is how you begin to think about these things. Is there an example of something like identity, that I have a problem with identity in our sources? You're not. You came just in time. So what they say is that it depends. It depends what you mean by they fell asleep. If you mean that they totally fell asleep, then right, they didn't eat the Paschal lamb and they have to do a Pesach Sheni, they have to do a second Pesach. But if you're saying that they dozed off, they're awake and not awake, they're asleep and not asleep. That's the language. The language in Hebrew is nim velo nim, tir velo tir, which means they're awake and not awake, asleep and not asleep. They're somewhere in the middle. So if that's their situation, so then nonetheless they can still, meaning they were still awake, they didn't stop thinking about it, really, they still had a connection to reality, they can eat it even later. And so they don't have to do a second Pesach. What is this thing of being awake and not awake and asleep and not asleep? So we all know what it is. It's like, right, it's that twilight zone between when you're awake and when you fall asleep. And let's say the example is that one of the Parshanim, one of the commentaries bring this. He says that somebody can ask you a question, and if they ask you a question, you might be able to answer it, but if they ask you to explain something reasonably, with some thought behind it, that you can't do. So the example would be that you're falling asleep, and your wife walks into the room, and she says, "Where did you put the reading glasses?" She'll say, on the dresser. That you can answer. But if she comes and she says, not where did you put the reading glasses, that you can maybe answer. But she asks you, tell me, did you already order the thing that you have to start thinking, did I do this, did I not do this? So that you can't answer. There you're at a loss. Anything that requires your cognition to work, that you can't do. What does this have to do with what we're talking about, identity? So they say something interesting, that in that twilight zone, you also don't know exactly who you are. That in that, if somebody would ask you who you are then, if it's something that would require any amount of thought, if they would ask you, what's your name? So that I know. But if they begin to ask you, do you think that so-and-so should be elected? Do you think this? You can't do that. Your identity is lost there. You don't know exactly what your opinions are and who you are and exactly what. So somebody would ask you, so how many years have you been working at your job? I have to calculate that I can't do. So I don't know exactly where I am. I'm in a twilight zone. For about 2,000 years, the Jewish people were asleep. What does it mean that we were asleep? That you can't ask a person who's asleep who he is. He is the way he is. You can't move him. So Jews, up to about 100, 150 years ago, when we started waking up, we were in a state of sleep. So that means that the identity was very, very set, very permanent, but nobody questioned. You couldn't, because you're asleep. You are what you are. That's how you are. But then, about 150 years ago, we began to wake up. And when you wake up, it's the same thing as falling asleep. You're in this twilight zone. That if somebody asks you a simple question, are you a Jew? Yeah, everybody says, of course I'm a Jew. But he begins to ask you, so what does that mean? So how does that translate into your daily life? How does that affect how you educate your children? These questions I can't answer. They're too difficult. I'm still in that twilight zone. I can't think about these things. I'm not there yet. That's where the identity crisis really starts. Because in us, and then it propagated further, because we're waking up right now. And as we're waking up, so what happened 150 years ago? Until 150 years ago, being a Jew was just the easiest thing in the world. It was clear what it was. And then suddenly everything fell apart. Why did it fall apart? In the same way that a person's identity falls apart when he's waking up. Just as when he falls asleep, it's the same thing when he wakes up. He doesn't know exactly yet where he is. It takes time to completely clear the cobwebs and start thinking. And then you begin to remember what you are. So this may be very surprising, what you're saying, that I'm suffering from something that you can compare to a person waking up. The Jewish people is a whole people. It's not one person. Yes, in a certain sense, we are one person. Then in a certain sense, what you said like about religion, another way of describing the Jews is that we're not a religion, we're a people, one person. It just happens to be that this one person is divided among, today, 15 million. But it's one person in the end. Right? And that person is now waking up. This thing that's called the Jewish people is now waking up. And as he wakes up, he has to begin to understand who he is. So it takes time. But the ripple effect is that the entire world is in an identity crisis. And everything becomes very identity-oriented. It's such a new crisis, they don't even have a word for it. In psychology, they don't even have a word for what is the identity energy. Meaning they understand there's something going on in the people's psyche that they want to have respect, they want to be recognized. But in the time of Freud even, there was no word for it. Freud took everything from the Greeks, so they looked for something from the Greeks. So nowadays they're using a word from Plato. It doesn't matter what the word is, it's going to change because it's not exact. But they have a word that they're working with now. They're trying to say there's a certain energy that as it wakes up, as you begin to feel it, it begins to populate yourself. It begins to define you. You begin to feel it, you begin to understand who you are. So that's, first of all, we have to understand that the source, like always, is us. That because we have an identity crisis, the rest of the world is in an identity crisis. And people don't know exactly who they are because we don't yet know who we are. But that means that we need to wake up. The faster we wake up, the better. The moment that we'll really wake up, then most of the problems will go away, because most of the problems are because we don't know who we are. If we knew who we are, the world would accept it very easily. Because the world has always known that there's a chosen people. The world has always known that there's B'ni B'chol Yisrael, my firstborn son, Israel. They know this. Everybody knows this. The problem is that we don't express it. We don't. Yeah, go ahead.
So, was there ever a moment in our history where we were awake?
Yeah.
Was there ever a moment and then we went back to sleep, or has it been just one process of waking up a little more every day for the past 5,000 years?
So the big moment that we went to sleep was after the destruction of the Second Temple.
Yeah. So there were moments of fully awake.
And because it's sort of like, when you find somebody who's asleep, so you have to make them comfortable. And because they're going to be asleep for a while, so you try to put a pillow underneath and this and that. So the rabbis, after the destruction of the temple, they built a Judaism that would be comfortable in a certain sense. It was a Judaism that was more survivalist. It wasn't a Judaism that came and said, here, this is who I am. They tried to even hide that to a certain extent and make you comfortable while you're sleeping. But now that you're waking up, you have to assume your identity again. You have to go to work. Once you wake up, usually it's a weekday and you have to go to work. And if it's not a weekday, you have to go to shul. It's not this. You always have something to do. And you have to re-engage the world. You have to come into contact with the world, but you have to remember who you are. You have to remember what your job is, and you have to remember what it is. Okay, so this is all about the source. Who remembers our identity? That's a big question. So first of all, the Torah remembers our identity to some extent. But like I said, you always have to understand the Torah in the relevant way in order to impress people who are living now and not 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago or however many years ago. And that is a process that's being done and was done by the Baal Shem Tov, by many others. One way of thinking about the Lubavitcher Rebbe was that here's a person who said, I'm going to wake everybody up. I'm going to tell them what their identity is. I see them waking up anyway. They're waking up, but they don't remember. So I'll remember. I'll make them remember. How can you make them remember? You send people out and you tell them the most important thing in the world. All the Chabad emissaries, the most important thing in the world is to make a Jew remember who he is. That's the most important thing. Everything else is secondary. And that's the thinking. That's what he ingrained in his emissaries, and it's a very important thing. There's other people, though, that can help you remember who you are. Sometimes it's the nations of the world, that they come and tell you, look, we remember something about you that you don't remember. And they remind you in all kinds of ways. Sometimes they're not so nice, and sometimes they're nicer. But as this process continues, and our identity becomes more and more an issue, it becomes something that we have to meet. We have to deal with this question. So then it turns out that the nations of the world have more and more of a role. They become more and more involved in it. One simple thing is that that Israel is the most prevalent topic in the world media, without any comparison. It's the most discussed country or state in the United Nations. Everybody's talking about it. Why are you talking about it so much? Why do you care? Does anybody care about Angola? Terrible things are happening in Angola. Okay, for a while people talked about the Ukraine. Does anybody still talk about the Ukraine? Here and there. It stops after a while. Why is it that almost nothing can trigger a tremendous discussion in the world? Because the world knows that to some extent its own identity depends on ours. And they're trying to say, so who are you? Who are these people who decided to go back there and reassume their identity? What is this identity? What does it mean? What does it mean for us? And so on. And they understand that in that sense we're the center of the world, in the sense that we need to nurture the world spiritually and psychologically. But there's another simple thing that can remind you of who. I'll talk more about the nations of the world in a moment, but there's another thing in the Torah that's very similar to this idea. When they were traveling through the wilderness, the 12 tribes were organized in a certain structure. There were 3 to the north, 3 to the south, 3 to the west, and 3 to the east of the tabernacle in the middle. And when they were traveling, that's when they were encamped. When they traveled, so the 3 tribes that were to the north were the last to travel, and they were called the banner of the Shevet, the tribe of Dan. And they had a special role. They said that whoever lost anything, they would return it to them. This tribe Dan, which is considered to be the simplest of tribes, meaning they had no scholars, they had no businessmen, they had nothing. They were like simple people. But their special role was to return whatever was lost, whoever lost it. That seems to be like something we're talking about. That if I lost my identity, who can give it back to me? So he said you can have big rabbis coming down and explaining this and that. But also the simple Jews. The ones who have nothing. But they know the identity a lot better than everyone else. When you meet a simple, what we call a Baal Shem Tov Yid, a simple person who may say all of Tehillim every day. He may say all of Psalms every day. But that's all he does. He doesn't know anything else. But he makes you remember your identity. He returns everything that was lost. He even returns lost identities. So if you lost yourself, he helps you find it. And everybody's met, I'm sure everybody's been to Israel, so you go with a cab driver and they're famous, that when you begin to talk to them about any topic in the world, suddenly you get this, like clarity. The guy knows everything. But he talks simply and earnestly, with passion about what he believes in, and usually you hear the Jewish identity in a very clear way. Okay? So it can come from above, it can come from the people who are the highest in a certain sense, who understand the Torah, who understand what the identity that the Torah talks about is, and it sometimes comes from the simplest people at the very end of society, but they have a clear notion of what it means to be a Jew. The clearest notion. Thankfully, whatever the politics might be, for the last 20 years, people think that, I wasn't going to talk about this, but it came up, so you'll excuse me that I bring some politics into it. People had the misconception that Benjamin Netanyahu was a right-wing politician. But that's not true. He did a lot of things that were exactly in keeping with the left-wing principles. But what was he? He was always based on Jewish identity. Every coalition, except for one that he built, was one that was trying to strengthen Jewish identity. Now, does Jewish identity include Judea and Samaria? Does it include Hebron? Does it include that? He didn't get into those questions. Jewish identity for him was the simplest thing in the world. It just meant that there should be more Yiddishkeit in the country. That's all. It didn't mean there was nothing very complex about it. It was sort of like a cab driver's attitude toward what it means to run a Jewish state. At a basic level, there has to be identity. So these two ideas, they can help us understand that we're waking up now, and as we're waking up, we have to face this question of who are we? And this question is not going to go away. Until we answer it, it's not going to go away, and we're going to see that if we don't answer it, then again the ripples get stronger and stronger in the rest of the world and in many, many areas that are hard to describe. Hard to even tell beforehand how they're going to be affected. So that's the first thing, that we always look for what is the source of this issue, where is it really coming from, and in the end try to provide some kind of answer for that. The other thing that we'd like to understand is what is this process of building identity? What is exactly going on when a person builds their identity? It's a process that's only now beginning to be studied, because nobody really has had a chance until about 30 years ago to begin to study this and to ask and to research it. So about this, the Torah has a tremendous amount to talk about, a tremendous amount to say, because the Torah has always been interested in Jewish identity. It wasn't always in a state. Right? There are always people who are awake in the sense that they're always dealing with the issues, they're always asking the questions. They didn't see it the way we see it today, but they had this question in mind. And there's many reasons that one would ask this question of how does identity develop? So one of the interesting concepts that shows up is that identity is related to a person's nature. Meaning, in other words, if I define myself as an observant Jew, and I say that's my identity, I always have to ask myself the question, is it also my nature, or am I just playing a role by forcing myself to be a certain way? Okay, am I acting, or is it my identity? This is something that in Hollywood I'm sure they discuss a lot. Because a good actor is somebody who assumes the identity so much that even after the filming is done, it's not easy for them to break out of it. It becomes like their nature. Right? So good identity, good strong identity means that it becomes my nature. What does it mean that it's my nature? So the sages say it's something very simple, that when I am praying and I come to the blessing of Modim in the Amidah, so even without thinking, my body leans forward. Why? Because my identity has already infiltrated my very nature. It's how I am. This is how I act. I act this way because this is how I am. When I first decided to wear black and white, so I had to decide to wear black and white. But after a while, first of all, you get rid of all the other clothes, and you grow out of, because life happens. So I don't have anything else today. But after a while, you get used to it. This is how I am. This is what I look like. I had a friend who became a Baal Tshuva, a friend that I grew up with in America. And when he was 23, 24, he prayed for the first time. And he later told me that this was the most self-conscious moment of his life. Meaning that he said, what am I doing? This is ridiculous. Who am I talking to? What am I talking to? You don't understand what it means. Today, it's natural. It's how you are. Because you've assumed the identity. You've become that thing. The Torah tries to tell us that being observant is not supposed to be something that is a continual struggle. That's not what we aim for. There's enough to struggle with in life. There's enough struggles, enough problems. It says when it comes to observance, those things should be natural. This is what you do, because this is how I do it. That's it. It's nothing special even. The fact that I don't do certain things on Shabbos, on Shabbat, is because I don't do them. It's because it's not shayach. It's not relevant. I don't have time for it even. The way that my day is structured on Shabbat, these things don't even have a place. They just can't happen. The fact that I'm like this or like that, again, it becomes what we call Jewish nature. I try to reach a state in which I don't have to struggle, because I have so many struggles anyway. I have so many things I have to deal with people, with my family, with my finances, with this, with that, with the other thing, with my work, that these things should become natural. That's when identity really becomes ingrained and integrated into a person. And it takes time, a lot of time, to habituate behavior. And the only way to habituate behavior is by being consistent. There's a book called Atomic Habits. Probably everybody has either heard of it or read it or seen it, I hope, by James Clear. So he built his life, his coaching life, around teaching people how to change their habits, how to adopt new habits. And the main thing that he talks about really is that you can't change your habits if you don't identify with them. To identify with something, with a habit, means that you don't just say, oh, I do this because right now I'm acting the part, I'm this or that. You say, this is really who I am. This is really the rest of the time maybe I'm doing something else. But this is who I really am. The moment that identity reaches that stage, or the habits become consistent enough that they become natural to you, and you don't have to think about it, that's when you have an identity. Of course, we're living, we're not frozen in time. So you're constantly striving to build new habits. A person who's at work, and he thinks about what habits would make him more money, so he also thinks about what new habits do I need to adopt now that will also contribute to what I'm doing. I'm never standing still. Identity really is not something that is ever really finished. You're constantly developing your whole life. You develop it through habits. You develop it through your interactions with other people, with things that you do, and by making them consistent. And the moment that you strive for consistency, you can, I assume, any identity that you want. And so this was talked about a lot in the Chassidut, especially, that the purpose of the Torah wasn't to make a person's life difficult. It was to help them assume an identity. And the moment that it becomes an identity, it's not a struggle anymore. It's just something, this is how I dress, this is how I am, this is how it is. When I wake up in the morning, the first I say Modani because I'm still in twilight zone. I wash my hands and I'm still half asleep. And that's how it needs to be. You don't have to think about these things. They're simple things. And then you have time for the real part of life, where you begin to think about, so where else do I want to go? What else do I want to do? But all of us have these consistencies that we build, and Yiddishkeit is supposed to be the same thing. Torah is supposed to be the same thing. If I want to learn 2 hours a day, so I begin to identify with that. I say, I'm a person who learns 2 hours a day. If I start from 10 minutes, then I'm a person who learns 10 minutes. It doesn't matter. But you have to identify with things, and your whole life, the whole purpose of life is to continually develop the identity. So it doesn't stop at any one moment. It doesn't stop after you've woken up and you remember who you are, but rather as you go through the day, you continue to add. You have to think about it. What do I want to add? What do I want to integrate into myself? You continue to add these things as you go along through life. There's a lot more that I want to say about this, but I see that we need to take a break at least.
I have a question.
Sure.
Yes, let's have a question.
I listened very carefully to everything you said. I don't know if it's intentional or unintentional, but you explained everything except perhaps the direct question that maybe a lot of people have. And
Yes, so ask it.
well, but I wanted to see if I can get a sharp answer, like an answer that my mind can understand. If somebody has really, in their mind, no crisis. I mean, you call it identity crisis, but the homosexuals often don't have any crisis. They say, no, I'm comfortable. I'm gay. I'm just, man likes man, woman, I'm comfortable. And I'm also very comfortable being a Jew. I am a Jew to the extent that I'm comfortable with whatever I do. Shabbat, no Shabbat, kosher, no kosher. But this is the. I'm a Jew. I'm comfortable with that. And I'm also gay, and I'm comfortable with that. Does the religion allow homosexuality? Just point blank.
Again, there's the act and there's identity. They're two different things. Okay? Torah doesn't tell you what your identity should be apart from being a Jew. It doesn't tell you whether you should be an athlete.
Against being homosexual.
Again, it depends what that means. If you're talking just about the identity, the person says, I'm only attracted to men. So that's what he is. If you're talking about is he allowed to perform certain acts, the Torah says no. And now you get a crisis because if the person says, I'm perfectly comfortable with my identity, but I also want to do something the Torah says that you shouldn't, then you have a crisis already. Then you have a problem, right? That's where the problem begins. It's not because the identity is a problem. The identity, okay, so my son identified as a snail. It's not a problem. Either it'll wear off, it won't wear off, whatever it is. But can you now, as a snail, eat non-kosher food? No. You have to stay within the confines of that. So if these two identities don't create any collision, so it's fine. I know I have a cousin who identifies as a homosexual, but he's very careful. He has a celibate life. He has no relations with anyone.
Oh, I guess I meant no. It just didn't mean just that.
I know.
So then the Jewish religion
That's why I'm
does
trying
not
to.
allow gay marriage, for instance.
Again, depends what it means.
Everything, the whole thing, marriage.
No,
sexuality.
of course not.
So there's a point like no.
Obviously the act is forbidden.
It is forbidden.
But if you want to live with an identity that is different than the normal identity, so I said the jury's out. I don't know. I don't think there's an issue. I said I don't think there's an issue, but I don't know. But it's not what the Torah is talking about. The Torah is talking about an act. That act is forbidden. Okay.
Is that still subject to ever evolving? Meaning that looking at the act in context of identity. So meaning if someone is straight, the act then is not okay. But in context of his identity being a straight person. But in context of being a gay person, then is that something that could evolve?
I don't see how, because it's very clear what the act is. The act itself is forbidden.
Mm-hmm.
Can't change the Torah.
Right?
The act itself is defined.
Yeah.
I'll give an example that would be, okay, it's a mixed crowd, but I'll still give it. In the Torah, it doesn't say really anything about when a man pleasures himself. So nothing really said. The closest thing that said is that there were two people. There were the sons of Judah who did this in order to, in a certain sense, they did it, but they didn't really do it, in order that their wife would not get pregnant. But there they did something else, which is they prevented her from having children. And preventing a woman from having children is a grave offense. But other than that, there's nothing mentioned. And yet, if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, it's the worst thing in the world. How did it become the worst thing in the world if there's not? It really is the worst thing. It's so bad, in fact, that they quote the Zohar, even the Shulchan Aruch quotes the Zohar, that there's no tshuva possible for it. It's so bad. So how did that happen? Shulchan Aruch was written in the 1600s. What was it before then? So also the sages said it's a bad thing, it's not a good thing. But still, how did you get it from the Torah? It's not in the Torah. So how did you learn this? So the Hasidic answer is very interesting. The Hasidic answer says that self-pleasure ruins your identity. That's another area where identity was discussed. What does it mean, your identity? It says that every person's identity, part of his identity is replacing himself in the world. Because we all know that we're mortal. We have an end. So every person has a need. Part of his identity is to propagate himself. How does he do it? He does it through children. It says, if you're pleasuring yourself, what are you doing? You're using the energy that you have in order to create a family, and you're using it to just cater to yourself. So he says that's hurting your identity. And so it's grave not because it's a problem in the Torah. It's grave because it's almost like a psychological reason. Because what you're doing is you're not true to yourself. And when you're not true to yourself, you can't do tshuva because God almost says it's between you and yourself. You go figure it out yourself. I can't help you here. You have to find a way to restore your own self-integrity. Because that's what is hurting, and so it causes crises in many things in your identity. It propagates also inside the psyche. And so a person who indulges in that, they lose themselves in a certain sense. So they have a problem. But that's really an issue that the way I've learned it is an identity issue. Not because the Torah says it's permitted or not. It's because we saw that, and it also makes sense, that you are hurting yourself by not being true to your own desires in the world, your own essence, your own self, as you want it to be manifest in your life, that you want to have children, that you want. So again, the person will say, it doesn't bother me at all. Okay, so he doesn't have an identity problem. But the sages think, and they say that this creates a real identity problem for a person. So what's the issue now? That the Torah doesn't say anywhere that you're not allowed to do this. So it's easier. So it's an easier problem, as it were. But and then it's just an identity issue. But here you have an identity issue, which again, we might say, maybe being gay is also being untrue to yourself. Why? Because you can't have children. Okay, that's an issue in and of itself. That would be an issue in and of itself. But let's say, like my cousin who decided that he's not going to have any relations with anybody. Okay, so that's how he solved his contradiction between his identity and between what he believes in terms of the Torah, his Jewish identity. And he says, that way I prevent the problem. So he has a problem with this. He lives, I can tell you that lives a very difficult life. But he says a lot of times, this is not different than a person who lives without legs. There are people who live their life, they were either born that way or they lost their legs at some point and they live their life. So he says, you're right, my identity is different. I can't express all of it. But I find this to be the only way that I can make this work together. But again, the Torah doesn't talk about identity. It doesn't say you should be like this or you should be like that. Sometimes the sages do, sometimes they don't. But again, it's up to us. It's in a certain sense that is evolving. That is constantly a question of where do we want to take this. Yeah.
So the Torah talks about relationships between parents, kids.
Mm-hmm.
What's, in your opinion, what's more detrimental? You describe it as a crisis, identity crisis, when you follow the act of homosexuality. Is that more detrimental, or parents who, for example, strain their relationship because their children are a certain way?
I think each one has its problems. By the way, I don't think that people have a difficult time defining themselves or finding their identity because of their parents necessarily. Sometimes it's nothing to do with the parents. And you see it in families, that there are children who have an easy time, no special problems, and children who are completely different and have all the problems in the world.
Does Torah allow for parents to accept their children or loved ones the way they are, even though they follow that?
Again, of course, because they're your children. How can you not accept them? You can't replace them. The question is, what do you do about, is it helpful to come and say, I want you to change your behavior? So my experience has been that I don't know how to change my children's behavior. We usually talk about the fact that there are 3 stages in a child's development, from 0 to about 5 or 6, from 6 to 11, and from 11 and on. From 0 to 5, we call it the habitual phase, meaning that if the child doesn't want to take a shower, doesn't want to take a bath, okay, I can pick him up and put him in the bath and give him a bath. From 5 to 11, it becomes more difficult. You can't just pick them up. You have to talk. You have to pick them up and also at the same time tell them stories and this and this. Either distract them or convince them or something like that. But once they reach age 11, 12, you can talk all you want. So there's only one way you can change their mind. You can think. You can say what you think, but you can't convince. They're 2 different things. I can share with you my thought process. I can share with you what I think. And I need to be very careful not to give up, because it's going to take time. But if I say it every day and I bring more things without any pressure, we do it as a nice conversation, no pressure, no, I'm not angry at you or anything like that. From them, my experience has been that usually my children listen. And they listen, and they listen, and it seems like they're not listening, but they listen, and they listen, and they listen, and suddenly one day they say, I'm doing this and this. Is it because of me? They don't remember that I even said it. It just happens. So once you reach that age of 11 or 12, what's called the revelation of what's called today puberty. So once you reach that stage of puberty, you have to think. You have to think and express what you think, but that's all you can do. So of course the last thing in the world you want to do is to ostracize someone. Why would you want to do that? It doesn't help. If it would help, but again I have to tell you what I think. I think it's like this, I think it's like that. Again, without pressure, but this is what I think. And they listen, sometimes they accept, sometimes they don't. What I know, why I called it a crisis, is because this is happening in families that are completely 100% Jewish identity and observant. And it still happens. So it's not coming from the parents. It's something that's propagating through the world. And again, you can blame the media, you can blame this, you can blame that. I said in the end you have to blame the Jews. Because in the end we're the ones who are guilty. Because we don't know who we are. We're waking up and we're trying to figure out who we are. Yeah.
Rabbi, as you mentioned the word crisis in today's society, I'm thinking about my everyday life today, and as we try to grow and internalize what we learn and what we experience, one of the problems I see that we have today is the interruptions.
The interruptions.
Interruptions.
Cell phones, you mean?
Cell phones or whatever comes because of anxiety, whatever causes you, especially like you said, the cell phones and so on. So how do you deal with this problem? Because we're all trying to grow, we're all trying to reach a higher level, and then we are put in a society where today's way of living has all of these in it. And if you want to shut it down, you can Shabbat, you can shut this down, you can shut that down, and so on and so on. But it's becoming to a point where I think that the older generation had more time to think about things, read it, or internalize it. But today's society, we can go, like let's say here, listening to a lecture, and then right away we have to do this and we have to do that, and there's no time to internalize it and so on. And I think that's a really the biggest problem to accomplish what you're trying to say in this society.
So first of all, you can't fight progress. It's not going to work.
Right.
Technology is going to always win against you. So the whole thinking that I can somehow stop it, that I don't think will even start. That doesn't even start that theory. That's not an option. So the option has to become, so how do I regulate this? And to regulate it is something that's possible, but you have to want to do it. It just means that there's a new type of human being that's being built right now. We don't understand it because we didn't grow up with this technology. We may see a little bit of it, but it's very hard to say exactly what kind of people are going to come out who have been affected by this type of technology. Okay? I'll say it in another way. It's very interesting. I'll tell you a story and tell me if you see the resemblance. There was a couple that didn't have children for a long time, and they came to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and as they, when he was giving out dollars, so a lot of people had the chance to ask him for things. So he said, "We don't have children." He looked at them for a second and he said, "Hang curtains made out of silk in your bedroom." Tough. So they did that. They hung curtains from silk in their bedroom. And lo and behold, 11 months later, they came and told him that they had a child. So the husband who this happened to, this is recorded. So he asked, it was uncommon for somebody to do this, but he asked the Rebbe, "How did you know? Like, is this written in some book, that there's a segula, that there's a charm for hanging?" He says, "No." And this is even more uncommon. He told him what happened. He said, "As you passed by me, even before you asked, suddenly in my mind came the tune and words for a certain nigun that we sing on Shabbos morning. And the words are, V'ilen milaya yehon lirkiyaya v'taman manshaya ala hu shimsha." These are words that were written by the Arizal, by the Rabbi Isaac Luria, and many people sing it on the Shabbat morning. What do these words mean? Literally they mean, and these things will become firmaments, and who dwells there? The sun. It's a Kabbalistic image from the Zohar. It doesn't matter really what it means. And then you asked me about a son. You don't, or children. You don't have children. What did this mean to me? It meant that these milaya can also be in Aramaic. Milaya also means silk. This word means both things and silk. So what I saw was silk. Yehon lirkiaya should become a firmament. The first firmament in the Talmud, you have to know Talmud to know this, but that's how his mind works. So the first firmament is called the curtain, a vilon. There's 7 firmaments, the first one is called the vilon. And who dwells there? The sun. But sun in Yiddish, and even in English you hear it, just means who dwells there? The sun. So it came to my mind that what you should do is you should put curtains up. So what is that, if not what happens to people when they turn on their phone and they happen to see something? Maybe that's something that they're seeing. For me, it doesn't mean anything. Maybe for me, it's like nonsense. But for a person who's equipped with the right frame of mind, maybe suddenly something clicks. He gets an idea from it. And maybe that is a different way of how the world is going to be working. That we think that the world is based on slow percolation until you integrate. But it could be, and this is promised, that in the time of the Mashiach, in these times, a person can learn all of Torah in 1 year today. No problem. Take a 12-year-old, I can teach him all of Torah in one, if he's willing to dedicate 4 hours a day to listen. But if he does it for 1 year, from 12 to 13, he'll know all of Torah. I promise him. Why? Because at age 12, your brain is usually a sponge. And there's recorded classes of everything. So he can listen. In 1 year, he can know what the biggest rabbi knows. He'll have to repeat it if he wants to remember it. But he can know it. It's not hard. In English, in French, in Spanish, in Hebrew, whatever language he wants. Maybe someone needs to do it in Farsi also. I don't know if it's been done yet. But in every single language that you want, you can learn the entire Torah. So now you take a person like that and you give him these things to look at. You don't know what's going to happen. Maybe what he's going to begin to see is associations that we can't even dream of. And maybe that's where the world is going, because people will have all the knowledge already integrated to a great deal. Maybe, as they're saying now, you'll take a pill. There's this idea. It's in the MIT Media Lab, that's what they're working on. You'll take a pill, and you'll know the Encyclopedia Britannica. They're working on this. They have an idea about how to do this. It'll work, won't work, I don't know. So, but if it works, now you give a person like this, you begin to give him little points of light, and you see what happens. The possibilities are endless. We don't know. And I'm just giving an example that the Rebbe's mind worked exactly like that. That something came to his mind, and he took it seriously. And he said, okay, this is what God is telling me now. And so he gave them this charm, and it worked. He didn't know if it would work or not. He wasn't like prophetic in that sense. He said, okay, it's worth a try. They haven't had children in 20 years. Doctors have tried everything. Maybe this will work, and it worked. So we have to also be open-minded enough to see that the way that we experience humanity is not the only way. I'll tell you another thing about the Rebbe. It's very interesting. Maybe we'll end with this. Before he became the Rebbe in 1950, the year between the previous Rebbe and when he became the Rebbe, he verbringed, meaning he sat with the people in 770 many times. And one of the things he talked about was genius. What is genius? So he says the common person thinks that a genius means that you do the same things but quicker and faster, or more of the same. Meaning, a genius in reading is somebody who reads faster than everybody else. A genius in finance is somebody who sees the patterns faster, or sees patterns deeper than others. A genius in relationships is a person who is always nice and always knows what the right thing to say, and so on and so forth. He said, that's not genius. Genius is ways of thinking and ways of behaving and ways of doing things that you cannot imagine. You take any topic in the world, a real genius, you won't understand what they're doing, because they're not doing more of what you know how to do. They're not just doing it faster. Like, for instance, you see this in chess. A real chess master, what do people think? He goes over all the different options, and he can just think really, really deep. He can think. That's what they do with a computer. That's not what they do. A real chess master goes over 2 options at most, 2-3 options at most. That's all he even considers. How does he know what to look at? All the different options of what you can do. After 10 moves, there's something like a quadrillion moves possible. How does he know? Well, how does he know what to look at? That's the genius. Because he tackles it in a completely different way that you and I can't even begin to understand. I don't know, maybe you're a grandmaster and you don't know, and you know how to do it. But if you're not a grandmaster, it's very hard to understand what exactly he's doing. And he does it very easily. It's tough work, but he knows right away where he wants to look and what the options are. He doesn't look at all the options on the board. It's impossible. There's too many. So we have to be open to the fact that it could be that a new type of person is being created now, who will benefit both from what we had, but very quickly, will quickly absorb everything that we need. If I had a teacher, like what today these recorded classes, if I had this 40 years ago when I was 10 years old, I would be a different person today. There's no question in the world, because I wanted to learn and there was nobody to teach me. So I only started to learn when I was much, much older. But what happens if you take a person who's 12 years old, like my children now, they know most of the Talmud by heart. They're in their teens, they're 18 and 19. They know most of it already by heart. Why? Because they can do it, it's very easy for them. Because they've dedicated the time and they know. Now, when they talk to me and I say something, they're in a different world than I am. I sometimes keep up with them, but not often. It's a different. You can do that in any area today. Do you remember what it was like to learn languages in high school? How many languages each person speaks? I learned in high school French. And in 4 years of high school, I picked up some French. I can converse a little. My daughter learned Dutch in 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Because she's crazy about Duolingo, and that's what she does. They don't even call it learning. They call it, can I play Duolingo? Duolingo is an app that you learn languages. They call it playing. That's what they do it. So she picked up Dutch in 3 weeks. Then she moved on to Spanish. Now they're learning Arabic. And every few weeks they change languages. Are they at the level that they are a native speaker? Probably not. But they understand. I show them things. What does this mean? They understand. That's something that we can't even imagine. Unless we were geniuses. And then geniuses pick it up maybe in 3 weeks also. But now a regular average person can do it. So we don't know what kind of person is going to be created by this technology. I don't see it as necessarily negative. Obviously for us it's negative, because we have a certain way of doing things, and if we don't learn how to regulate it and control it, we lose what we had very quickly. But for the young people, it could be that this is not anything detrimental. I keep telling this to my wife, by the way. She's not convinced. But, okay, yeah.
I want to bring up the reason why our conversation started about identity crisis. So it gives a little bit of a context, which I think it will address some of your questions, and the rabbi's response. A year ago, 2 years ago, Kathy and I were facing a very serious consideration. My boys go to school and they have gay friends. And we have some friends, one specific friend whose daughter was behaving, she was saying, I don't want to be, I'm not a girl anymore. She was having gender issues. And she was actually saying that I am a boy. One day, my son, Ethan and Jonathan, one day we were sitting on a Shabbat dinner and I tried to bring up something about Torah as much as I can, and I noticed that they were having some resistance and they were having some issues. And I said, what's going on? And they said, how do you explain the fact that Torah says that we should kill gay people or something to that extent, stone them, whatever. I didn't know how, because they have friends who are gay friends and they are very sensitive about this issue. And also our friend whose daughter was having that problem or that transition, whatever, and we didn't know how to talk to our kids about this. Now, maybe somebody who goes to a completely religious school or observant school, which I don't think that, based on what I understand, that's still an issue there, but maybe they don't experience these issues. But we live in a world that this came up, right? This came up. And for some time I was struggling. How do I answer my children? How do I address this? I don't know. And I've done forum, this, that. I've studied philosophy, Rumi, this, that, and I know everything. I didn't know how to answer my children. So I was soul searching, talking to different people, talking to rabbis, talking to whatever.
So in one of our initial conversations after I met Rabbi Genuth and we were going through our studies, I actually was really not very comfortable for me to bring it up, but I thought I'm going to just bring it up because I'm at a very bad point because nobody has been able to answer me. So I brought it up. I said, how exactly what I just explained. How do I explain to my children about this issue of gay homosexuality, and how does Torah addresses it? I don't know how to explain it. And that's where he said, the kind of what's being addressed in Torah is not what's being experienced today. And then the rest of the lecture that you heard. It's not the same. And the thing is, people have to understand, and I'm going to tell you something that was very profound for me. People have to understand that, for example, the girl that decided, and we found out later on by the parents of the girl who told us this, by the way, it's empirical, it's not, it wasn't our thinking. It was like the girl was having some problems at a very young age, and not knowing how to address these problems, and the fact that right now this generation looks for answers only in social media. That's where they get all of their information. Google it. Or social media. She was exposed to people who are saying, this is how you're feeling, you must be a boy. Right? That's what you're experiencing. Now, that's a crisis of identity, because later on after she went through this whole struggling, then she realized that it's not what I want to be. And she switched. But the crisis that we are talking about, the crisis is that because in our communities, and this is my take, my insight, what have I given my children as an identity? I didn't teach them basis of Torah. I didn't know it myself. Persian family, grew up in America. I tried to make him more American than Persian by language and all that. And if that's what I taught him, then that's what they're gravitating towards, listening to that community, listening to that conversation. And that's what gets imprinted on them. That's the crisis. How they see themselves through me as a father, through Torah, or through social media. It's a crisis, in my opinion. Are we really equipped? Are we really able? Have we been, and this is my question for myself, I'm not addressing to you guys. I'm telling you, those were the questions that initiated this conversation with the rabbi and this whole learning about identity issues. And I actually had to go back to them at one point after this lecture and some conversation, and I actually explained that to them. I said, look guys, one more very important thing that he brought up that I was able to communicate with my kids. So I asked them, how does Rav Ginsburg address this issue? I asked them, I appreciate your thoughts. How does Rav Ginsburg? And actually that was what put me in the right place, to be honest with you. with all due respect. He said, actually, it's very interesting. About 2 years ago, or sometime a few years ago, a group of people came and asked the Rav to actually give a speech about the issue of homosexuality and how do we deal with it. How do we deal with it? They offered a lot of money for his lecture. They offered so much money that would have run their organization for 2-3 years, whatever that is. So, what was his response? He came back and said, there has not been enough revelation about this issue for me to speak about it or speak to it. I cannot accept the engagement. Now, I don't want to. Now, when I heard that, I thought, if Rav Ginsburg says there has not been enough revelation that I cannot speak to it, me and my children should not be really even questioning this right now. We should just accept the fact that there is an issue and we don't have an answer, and don't point fingers and don't blame and don't give up our convictions. So it was really comforting that it's not just me that's having a struggle with this issue. Explaining it to my kids, explaining it, or dealing with our friends who are having that issue. The world is having a problem with this. And I'm not saying the world is having problems with gay people, with homosexual people. It's not even the issue. The issue is we don't know how to deal with that. There hasn't been enough revelation. And we do, because there hasn't been enough revelation, because we don't know how to deal with it, we are living in a crisis because of how our kids. Now I keep thinking about, people who are frum and in the Orthodox community, and maybe they don't thank God that because of the restrictions that they put on access to this social media, maybe there's a little bit of immunity from it. But the fact is, this is the world, and actually. It has been addressed, I think, by Rebbe and by other rabbis that don't think of social media as evil. How you use it determines its value. You have to use it for learning about homosexuality, whatever it is, your identity. We got a problem. Who's teaching you identity? But it can be used for Torah learning, for example. Anyway, so that's what. So for me, what brought up this conversation, which I thought it was an urgent matter. Definitely for me it was an urgent matter, was this context of how do I talk to my kids about this? How do I tell them? I don't have but it's an issue for this generation. Anyway.
Well, I'll just end with the fact that it's what I started with. It's a dialogue. It has to be more and more thinking about it. It's not something that we have under our... And again, because I separated two issues. There's something called identity, and there's acts. They're not necessarily related. Sometimes they're related, sometimes they're not. It depends on the person.
I have a question. The fact that there's some mitzvahs of don't do or do, doesn't that give a direction as to where the path to the answer may be? I mean, at least we can look in the right direction rather than just get stuck in the confusion. Because in that state of confusion, there is no hope. But the fact that in the Torah it says, don't. I mean, I understand as the way that I kind of came with peace for myself was that I see humanity as a bisexual. There is a possibility for every gender to
develop.
Sexuality with different things. The fact that Torah gave a direction to the society in order to be able to navigate in a certain manner that created a certain culture with a working relationship with the society that could, and it works. Now, within the navigation of life for the humanity, all of these things comes up. All of these questions and confusions and inclinations and challenges comes up. But having those is not the problem. Is not. It just is. But the knowledge of what to do with those as to not get stuck with those things is where defines Judaism, I think. So for me, I thought that there may be even a solution to the problem of homosexuality, although it sounds as if there is not. But my philosophy as a possibility, I don't know, I haven't experienced it as a fact myself, but as a philosophy, I think that the same way that you can experience a certain inclination, like robbery. I want to take this and take it home because I really love it. You know, although it doesn't belong to me. But I choose not to be run by that inclination, and I choose the path of quote unquote do not steal that has formed in the society called Torah, regardless of what I feel, and that will give me the path to clear myself of the inflation of robbery and give me a choice to go forward. Otherwise, I can always justify that, but I have this inclination and I have no idea what to do with it. Of course I know what to do with it. I believe that the gift of Judaism to humanity was the possibility of distinction and action based on a knowledge that you can be beyond where you are stuck. And that's that the Jewish people have within the humanity, and that's the responsibility of the Jews in order to show the light to the Gentiles. Otherwise, what's the difference? If the Jews cannot have a direction, they might as well be the Gentiles. The Gentiles are going to look up to us because we may have something that they don't. I believe that there is a solution to the problem of sexuality in the direction that humanity can be productive and that's following the direction of the mitzvot of do not do. Although you may feel like doing it.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that the people that have that inclination, so-called married, and have children regardless, and they're committed to the life of do not do, and put their energy in the learning of the knowledge of why do not do, rather than getting stuck into we don't have enough information. I believe that we have the information. And I think we do not have the
Courage.
the courage to test that. Yeah, we have to test that. That is what is going to make the difference for my children when I want to give them an answer. Because I tell them that life is not based on what you feel. Life, there is a distinction of what works and what doesn't work, and what humanity, there is a direction that humanity is going to take based on the action, regardless of what you feel. And that's the distinction that I personally try to teach my children by sending them to a Jewish school. Otherwise, what's the difference of spending all of this money and all of this time to send them to a Jewish school rather than Beverly High? Beverly High had a much bigger gym than Hillel, for example, and it was free. I do not accept the fact that we do not have the information. And I believe that rabbi, that Rabbi Ginsburg, he should have accepted that money and he should have given the direction to the Jewish people who came to ask him a question, and I believe that he made a mistake. He didn't have it. That's my honest opinion. Just because he is a big rabbi, it doesn't mean that he made the right
one thing might
decision.
clarify, just maybe I misspoke. One thing to clarify, it wasn't the rabbi who said, I don't have the clarification. He said, there hasn't been enough
It's a revelation.
revelation for the humanity. You're saying we have the solution, which is in Torah. Okay. No, but that's not what I
I
said.
know, but when people go to the rabbi
No.
to ask him a question, they are not asking a question about the solution for humanity. They are asking, what does Torah says about this problem? This is his responsibility, is to say what does Torah says about that thing. What's happening in humanity is none of his business.
I totally hear you, Maurice, but I always had a different thought, and I don't know if this is maybe along the right, because you were talking about identity. I don't think in those days there was such a thing as someone knowing they're homosexual.
Right.
There was nobody who said,
Mm-hmm.
woke up and said, I'm a homosexual. There was no such thing as being a homosexual. It was the act.
Right.
And I think if we continue on that thought, when they spoke about the act, that was usually when it was done was to like suppress, like as an act of making someone submissive. It was an act of violence and violating someone.
It could
was
be.
not. It was not in the context of. And
There were all kinds of reasons for
could it
it.
be that? Am I misremembering? Maybe there's the part where it's talking about like when people go to war and the things that they can do during war and not do during war, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was common to rape women and also men as part of
No, men were usually beheaded.
huh?
Men were usually beheaded, but maybe young boys.
But,
maybe.
but like, and also, you know, you see it now in prisons, you know, prisoners who are not gay, but they do it as an act of suppressing somebody
It could
and,
be,
and
Yeah.
kind of domination, thank you. So when I think about it, it seems like because there was no such thing as, or at least very
As identity,
rarely,
as a homosexual.
as an identity
Right,
where
right.
someone is doing it because they love somebody and it's a consensual act and it's
It could be done out of love, but it was sexual.
that specific commandment that
That's
talks
exactly the
about
point.
in the Torah is given in the context of not when two men, I mean, I'm not saying it because I'm very comfortable with it, I'm uncomfortable with it also, but I'm trying to understand our day is very different. That when two men say, you know, we love each other and why can't we be together if we both want to do it, and this is for us an act of love, that may be something different than what was spoken as.
So again, I said
During
the
that-
act is not changed. The act is still the same act. The reasons for it are different today, but it's still the same act. But what I was trying to say was that this concept that you just said, homosexuality, was not an identity until 80, 100 years ago. It simply was not an identity.
So, but
It was an act.
Do you think like when they talk about it in the Torah, about the act,
Yeah.
was it in the context of two men who want to be with each other?
It doesn't matter what the context. It could be war, like you said. It could be because they love you. The Torah doesn't
Torah is
doesn't
not
make a
addressing.
doesn't make a differentiation.
Yeah.
How does it justify the fact that homosexuality have always been part of the history?
That's
So
exactly
that
why it had to say.
Sodom and Gomorrah was based on homosexuality.
Right, but that's exactly why the Torah had to say this act is forbidden.
Yeah.
And
then-
that's why I
and then
didn't.
Is really the question of identity? Is it really a new
Yes.
a new problem,
Yes.
or it has been around? I mean, is there any new thing under the sun?
That's what I
At
tried to
the end
explain.
of the day, or this is just the history that takes itself.
So that's what I tried to explain. There's always people who were ahead of the curve. There were always people who were noblemen, who had time, who went through the whole process of deciding who they were. There were always people like that, but it was not a common thing in humanity. Today, because everybody's in a different place, this has become an issue. There were always people who, some of the sages knew things that we don't know yet about ourselves. Because they were so introspective, they were so aware of themselves, that we're not even at that level right now. But those are, again, the geniuses. They were always on the fringes. Now we're talking about, when we say a crisis, we mean that this is propagated throughout humanity, everywhere. It's a different reality altogether. It's been caused, I think, mostly by the fact that we have a long process of becoming mature, which didn't exist 200 years ago. There was simply no process. You had at age 6 or 7, you were already working. So there was no time for these things. So the Torah never talked about identity in any respect. From the sages, I can get a few hints in here and there, but I can't get a discussion of this thing called identity. So when I talk about identity, it's not just the question of whether you want to you define yourself as a homosexual. It could also be that, again, that you define yourself as a 5-year-old, and it could be other things. It doesn't have to be something that's necessarily forbidden. Okay? It can be actually something that we don't know. It's permissible. It's whatever you decide from now on that you're a chicken. Okay, so you're a chicken. There's a story like that from Nachman. Somebody decided he's a turkey. So what do you do with this? This is a common problem that psychologists face. It's not something esoteric. It's something that happens all the time. So what do we do with it? So I tried to say, first of all, I'll recap, that in the end it's up to us, but not always is the solution direct. Sometimes the solution is, that's what I tried to say, that it's because of our identity as Jewish people that the world is suffering from this identity crisis. It came from somewhere and it'll go away. But what I'm saying, again, you don't have to accept. You can say he's wrong. But the claim is that it all starts from us. If we define our identity well, the rest of the world will fall into place because that's our role in the world. We're the center of the world when it comes to spirituality, when it comes to psychology. If we're able to do things right. What you said about that a person would prevent himself, would go the right path if he would just control himself. I've talked to many homosexuals. No, I'm sorry, I understand. I've talked to many homosexuals. I know many of them, they've been in therapy with me many times. I haven't found that useful. And they haven't found it useful. What does it mean? Again, I said there are examples of people who hold back and they lead a celibate life and you know, kol hakavod lehem, they're really special people. But most of them cannot control themselves that way. When they're looking for a solution, they want a pill that they'll take, and suddenly they'll be attracted to women. That's what they want.
Is that possible?
No. We don't have anything like that. It might be possible in 10 years, but it's not possible right now. The problem with identity is, what happens to people who say, even when there's such a pill, I don't want to take it? Right?
I don't think there is ever going to be a pill.
Oh, it could definitely happen. Okay. Yeah.
Before we break for dinner, because it's
Shopper had
time.
a
Shopper had a
question.
question.
Huh?
Shopper has a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I have a question, not a comment.
No, please go ahead. I'm sorry.
So I actually like what Kathy said because it appears that this behavior has been present in human history for thousands of years.
Yeah.
Probably before even we had history.
Okay.
But I like the way the Torah distinguished between the action and the identity.
Uh-huh.
The identity of homosexuality is a 19th, 20th century
Right.
concept.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? If we go back to the time of Rumi, we don't even know if Rumi and Shams Tabrizi were lovers. They called each other lovers. Okay? So, I like the way the Torah defined it, because it leaves the rest up to us. It creates this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful.
And I also think that there are precepts in Judaism that supersede each other, which guide us. And the most important to me is what we say twice a day. We say echad. One, because we as Jews are supposed to believe that everything, we're not talking about there's only one God. We're talking about everything is one. So when I sit and I talk to a human being in front of me, it might be somebody I totally dislike,
Mm-hmm.
disagree with, but they are a piece of God sitting there in front of me, and I have to respect them and I have to treat them well.
Jew or non-Jew?
Doesn't matter. It does not. If there's a dog in front of me, it's a piece of God. I have to treat that dog well. It has consciousness. We believe that the sun has consciousness. We believe that a rock has a little piece of consciousness. Everything is part of the same thing. And if we really believe that, then we understand what these politics are, the 20th century politics, which, as Sharon said, Shlomo said, there's politics which are creating this dilemma, because right now we're differentiating identities that we don't even want to. In China, they're killing people for meditating, taking their kidneys out and killing them because they meditate. Or they're Muslims. That is a form of identity politics, just like homosexuality. So what does the Torah tell us? The Torah tells us, look, this is not an identity issue. This act is not good, don't do this act. But the rest of it is a personal journey. Each human being is born, and according to Kabbalah, we're born many times, because we're going through these journeys like a washing machine. We come to planet Earth, and our soul keeps getting washed. And we come back again, our soul gets washed again. And in the process, we elevate. And so maybe somebody is bestowed with the identity of homosexuality. We should not judge them, we should love them, we should treat them as one, because all of us are one. And that's why I think when the rabbi says the rest of it is dialogue, I think it kind of reminded me what Hillel said. Hillel, standing on one leg, said, do not treat others the way you do not want to be treated, the rest is commentary. So I think it's basically that. We are the people who talk, and we're the people who have dialogue. And we solve problems as we go. And I think we need to respect what Torah said about the behavior. And the rest is commentary, because we have other precepts which tell us how to behave as Jews.
Very well put.
Before we break, because we have to go, I'm just going to finish with this. And